Gold mining in Madre de Dios. Gold mining in Madre de Dios is a major environmental justice issue that needs to be addressed. Madre de Dios is located in Peru. Peru is the eighth biggest gold producer. In the last 10 years, there has been an increase in illegal gold mining groups in Madre de Dios. This increase in illegal gold mining groups in Madre de Dios has led to mass deforestation and has violated environmental protected areas. In 2014, around 36,000 acres were removed illegally to clear way for gold mining groups. According to the Amazon Conservation Association, there are around 59,000 out of the 175,000 mining groups, that are working with no permits. You can see this next picture is an aerial view of Madre Dios. It is clear that within just a year, the progress of deforestation is taking. In order to harvest gold, mercury is used to draw out the gold from the land, which creates a mixed gold nugget with gold and mercury. In order to isolate the gold, the mercury is burned off and the mercury is then released into the environment. This process emits around 30 to 40 tons of mercury into the atmosphere annually. In 2015, 1.1 metric tons of mercury was being recorded to be released monthly. How did this happen? The Amazon Conservation Association predicts 3 reasons why gold mining has increased in Madre de Dios. The first is the Interoceanic Highway. The Interoceanic Highway was recently completed and it spans for more than 1,500 miles following the coast of Peru. It goes through the Andes and the former Incan Empire and through the Amazon. It has also increased drug trafficking. Because the gold prices have increased around the world, people have scrambled to find the gold sources and to be the first to harvest them. In Latin America, there is a huge abundance of gold within the land. The second reason would be the financial collapse. In Peru, there was, due to natural disasters in the area, the Peruvian economy has suffered for the last 8 years. In 2016, nearly 1.2 million Peruvians lived in extreme poverty, while 8 million live in some form of poverty. You can see here on this graph the GDP of Peru. You can see where it's dipped around 2002 and where it's slowly increased due to the increase of illegal gold mining. On the graph in the left, you can see the price of gold, which had increased around 2012, 2011. Although it has declined and slowly settled down, the increase of gold mining became a sustainable way for some people to live in Peru, although it was only sustainable for them. Some stakeholders in the illegal gold mining are the poor Peruvian citizens from the north. Because of the interoceanic highway, many people living in the north who did not have access to jobs or did not have the education for jobs were able to use the highway to go to places where they could get easy jobs. Well, not really easy, but easy enough to do without education or major changes in lifestyle. Many people who take part in illegal mining are individuals trying to make enough money to survive. Another stakeholder is the Peruvian government. The Peruvian government is a stakeholder because around $10 billion was in 2012 was exported from gold exports. Another key element from gold mining is that illegal miners earn from $30 to $75 a day. This is going into the poor Peruvian citizens who don't have enough money to create a sustainable lifestyle. They basically just use the interoceanic highway and find jobs that are easy enough to come up with some sort of money to provide for their family. The other stakeholders would be companies around the world. Because Peru is such a big exporter of gold, a lot of companies rely on Peru and their exports. And finally, the 3 major indigenous groups in the Madre de Dios area, the Harukpum, Eseaha, and the Mastehenia. You can see from the graph here, Peru GDP from mining has exponentially increased since 2015 to now, and it is more profitable than their illegal drug trade. So the environmental effects. The process for the gold mining is really not worth the yield. Between 2001 and 2013, around 168,000 hectares of the forest were cleared just for the small-scale gold mining. That's greater than the size of London. Last year, a research team from DC, the Carnegie Institution for Science, found that the gold mining in Peru destroys around 5 to 10 hectares of protected national rainforest every day. You can see from the photos the destruction of the land. These pictures here are rivers that had been dried up. Another effect from the gold mining is the release of mercury into the rivers and the lands. The environmental effects and the human effects are actually tied in because of the release of mercury into the land. But the main environmental effect that is separate from the human effect would be the deforestation. But it also causes a lot of disruption with the ecosystem because it tears down. In order to get to the gold, there has to be removal of basically all levels until the soil layer, which makes it really hard for any progress of like restoration. And it's not worth the yield because a lot of times the amount of gold that comes out from the gold mining is not enough to pretty much make any money. In one reading, I found that one person said that the only gold they found for about a week was enough to make one wedding band, which is certainly not enough for the cost that it's causing. So the human effects, there's a lot of different human costs. The first and the most important would be the mercury pollution. Mercury pollution affects the nervous system, and children are 5 times more sensitive than adults because their systems are still developing. Some symptoms from mercury pollution are vision, speech, hearing, and mobility impairment. That pretty much makes it impossible to do anything once you've been poisoned with mercury. So the same institution that found that 5 to 10 hectares of land, protected land, was being destroyed, found that 9 out of 15 fish species that were the most commonly consumed in Madre de Dios contain levels of mercury that surpass the safe limit. And since fish is like the main part of these people's diet who live in this area, Madre de Dios, they pretty much all have some sort of level of mercury poison. The study also found that 78% of the people living in Puerto Maldonado, which is the capital of Madre de Dios area, had levels of mercury that again surpassed the safe limit. In regards to the indigenous tribes who are living there, they're also huge stakeholders because the land that they're living in is being taken over by groups, not only just small scale miners trying to find jobs, but also like drug cartels and criminals because the gold industry is so lucrative. A lot of people use that money to fund different sorts of things. And you can also see this all throughout Latin America. And that the gold mining is being used to fund certain criminal activities. So in one article I found, an indigenous tribe member who's part of his own organization to defend his tribe says that the miners not only pollute our water, but also our culture. They are looking just to get rich quick and have no interest in conserving our land. When they do find gold, they often drink heavily and look for prostitutes. We worry about the youth in our community. So this is another point of the human cost, is it's not only just the land and the economic cost to the people, but it's also the culture cost because there's a lot of people whose basic lifestyles are being changed to, like, the culture is being changed from one that focuses on the earth and giving back to what it gives to us is more of taking and corrupting it. So another thing that sticks out is that the areas that have the small scale miners don't really have any government authority because they're so small. there's a lot of corruption and abuse of the workers. Generally, the areas without the government have forced labor and like forced bondage, and criminal miners use fake jobs to offer um, wages to girls and essentially force them into working in the brothels near the mining towers, mining towns. And the police estimate that there's over 405,000 girls that have been trafficked for sexual exploitation in bars that were frequented by minors. And that goes into what the indigenous man said, and it's clearly backed up by fact that the minors aren't only hurting the environment and the people in the area, but also their culture. So that's just one thing to look at. So this is a video I found. It gives a pretty clear outline and a human face to what I'm talking about. It goes into depth from certain people in the area. It also shows that this issue's kind of gone out of the news because this video is from a few years ago and this issue is still happening. So you can see just from this video the human effect in more of a specific way instead of just the facts. You can see people's faces and understand that it's not just the idea of mercury poisoning, but you can see it's actually happening. And you can also see that a lot of people are ignoring it because the main people affected are indigenous people and women. Okay. Oops. Okay, so some organizations and advocacy groups involved. So the first one is the COHARYIMA, and that is actually an indigenous-based group that's specific to a certain tribe in the Madre de Dios area. And the man who heads that is the same man I talked about earlier, who was talking about how the gold miners were corrupting his culture. So he has his own group where he essentially is fighting for justice within his tribe. and another group is an Alliance for Responsible Mining. They basically just focus on creating more sustainable habits for minings and small focused groups. And finally, the Amazon Conservation Association. They're the main people who have studied and focused on the effect of the small-scale gold mining in this area. So they're one of the main people I chose. There are a few other groups, but not they don't have as much as a big effect as these three groups do. So this is another example of what the Alliance for Responsible Mining group does. You can see that they really focus on policy reform and education and supporting the communities that rely on the mining. And I think this is a very responsible and sustainable way to look at mining, instead of just thinking, okay, we should just have everyone in this area stop mining, because that's just not feasible because so many people rely on it. It's more of changing how people depend on mining, and that there's a lot of different ways to practice sustainable habits within mining. And the Amazon Conservation also focuses on that because they provide some alternative ways, instead of just focusing on mining, but spreading out to like ecotourism, aquaculture, agroforestry, and creating programs to educate people of the Madre Dios of the harmful effects of mercury pollution, because once people become aware of the harmful effects, they're more likely to stand up and be against the certain way of mining that most small-scale miners use. And finally, the Amazon Conservation says that because the land in the area of Madre Dios is so torn down, it's a great place to start for practices of regrowth and kind of just testing what works, because there's so much deforestation already. This area would be a great way to start like testing and seeing which methods work best. So how does this connect to what we learned? Well, a few readings really jumped out at me. The first one would be The Hidden Cost, the Human Rights Abuse in the Thailand Shrimp Industry. There was a lot of really similar ideas, that there was the inequality women face because there's a high rate of illiteracy. This was I also found in my research with Madre de Dios, and there was a clear connection to the Thai shrimp industry because the Thai people, they take the work that they could get to create a somewhat livable lifestyle, and even though that work was so strenuous to them, they take what they can get because they need to create basically any financial gain for their family. So the working conditions are awful. The women are taken advantage and trafficked. The only thing that was different with the Thai shrimp industry is that they're a little more sophisticated with their technological advances, but they still work people to death, essentially. And in Madre Dios, it's the process that they use for golden mining is very elementary. And then another reading that stuck out was the Common Ground reading, because I saw that with the man who created and is fighting for his tribe's rights was very similar to what the Common Ground reading suggested, is that these indigenous groups are setting up for themselves, and they're on a journey to gain formal recognition from the Peruvian government to fight back for their land and their culture. So it was really great to see the Common Ground reading in a practical setting with an actual example. So I also decided to look at the environmental justice principles in place, see which ones I thought were being violated or were relevant in the situation. So I found the first one, which would be the environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity and independence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. You can just see that the deforestation is destroying the ecosystem. The third would be the environmental justice mandates the right to ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land. You can already tell that these people are being forced through the poverty to make unethical decisions. So we also talked about how one way to combat this environmental justice issues is to focus on the poverty and the economics of the situation. I think that's something we talked about in the Bullard reading. And fourth would be the protection against nuclear testing, production, disposal of toxic waste, because there's so much mercury. So the environmental justice community, you can see there's just so many different examples of how much this is tied in with environmental justice. So the main question that I'm focusing on is, what can we do to help with what we know? Oops. So the main question I wanted to focus on was, what can we do? Because with everything we've just learned and focused on, it's like our main focus should be, what can we do now that we know this? So the United States prohibits trade in wildlife, fish, and plants that have been taken illegally under the Lacey Act. So the ACA offers a lot of different ways that we as consumers can push for the American government to be more restrictive on the illegal trade imports into the U.S. So that's one of them. The ACA also says we should advocate for stricter controls on mercury trade, because Peru doesn't restrict mercury imports, and that's a huge factor in the gold mining, because if Peru can't import the mercury, one, there'll be less mercury in the environment, and two, there will also be less people using mercury for small scale mining, and also to support organizations working on the ground in Peru to combat the gold mining and promote sustainable economic alternatives. I think something we have to do as consumers is push the Peruvian government as well, because a lot of times the government can recognize that so many citizens rely on the small scale mining just for everyday financial support, that there must be a better way, and they need to support their citizens through their economy instead of just trying to focus on the environment, because both are tied, as we saw in the Bullard reading. And there's also a lot of very detailed stuff that the ACA has provided, and there's a link to that in the summary notes of my presentation. So thank you for listening.